The Walking Dead was a groundbreaking show when it first released, starting in 2010 and ending just recently in 2022. At its viewership peak, it was a juggernaut of television, proving exactly what a great show had the potential to become on cable. Still, because of an amalgamation of factors, as the story stretched out over a massive 11 seasons, viewership lagged towards the end. The first few seasons may be the ones that typically garner the most acclaim, and rightly so. However, while certain elements of the story may have lagged as corporate politicking and AMC ran rampant, the later seasons of the show did succeed in one thing: their core villain, Negan. All too often, the character's equally iconic and controversial introduction is the extent to which the audience remembers Negan as a character. However, it's what came after that tragic event that made the all-out war arc of seasons 7 and 8 special. Earlier seasons could be focused on the apocalypse itself, with mere survival being the endgame, but the show needed to undergo a shift to keep the progression of the story seem natural as seasons stretched on. The only way that the show could expect to stretch out into many seasons and still stay realistic is if the main conflict evolved. It couldn't simply become a show where Rick and the crew ran into villains of the week and scraped by with violence, and the savagery of the Terminus arc had already seen Rick reaching the lowest depths of barbarism in the show. There are only so many times a show's main character can rip the throat out of a man with his teeth and still expect the audience to sympathize with him. The natural progression of Rick's character was that he had to become something better than the savage he'd been forced to evolve into on the road. The introduction of a safe haven like Alexandria allowed him to still use the violence he had learned to help protect the place, but more than that, it allowed him to become human again. As Rick ascended into a leadership role in Alexandria, from a narrative perspective, the next step for him would have to be proving that he could become a pillar of humanity, one that could set up a realistic future for Carl and the next generation. In order to do that, he'd have to ascend into something greater than Rick Grimes the individual. And, in order to make that happen, he needed to face off against a villain who represented far more than just one man. Because at the end of the day, the all-out war arc wasn't a battle of Rick versus Negan, it wasn't even a battle of Alexandria versus the Saviors. All-out war means one thing. Rick and Negan's conflict was one of ideology, just the most recent chapter in a struggle that had been going on since the advent of civilization. Even in a post-apocalyptic world, war still boils down to one thing: economy. The introduction of Alexandria as a community allowed Rick a space where he could revert back to that core sense of justice that made him become a cop in the first place. The ability to be able to adhere to what someone thought is right or wrong is a privilege, and it wasn't one that Rick was afforded while on the road after the fall of the prison. The shaving of his wild man beard and the trimming of his hair wasn't just a luxury, it was a symbol of the rebirth that Rick could have in a community like Alexandria. It's no coincidence that he sported the clean-shaven look as a policeman before the apocalypse. A clean-shaven Rick Grimes is emblematic of the Rick that was a fully fledged member of society. On the road, his savagery grew, and with it the wild look that his beard brought. Still, he found that he couldn't fully return to being a truly civilized person anymore. A medium was reached after Rick saved Alexandria from potential Walker disaster and in the same stroke killed Pete Anderson, Jesse's husband. With that, a more well-kempt beard, and along with it balance, was restored. Rick could become a better leader by combining the two lifestyles, and thus he successfully married the two worlds of civilization and savagery. However, here's where a problem arose narratively. Alexandria was thriving, and Rick had shown that he could be a leader, at least on the individual level. Still, unfortunately for the main cast, a show with no conflict for the main character is no show at all. At this point, Rick was feeling nigh invincible. He had even led Alexandria to destroy a group who were presumably the entirety of the Saviors, though it turned out to be just one outpost. Rick had proven irrefutably that on an individual level, he could be a capable and just leader, and the introduction of a villain that would only challenge him on a personal level would have only served to reaffirm what the audience already knew about him. What was needed was a villain who would allow Rick to be challenged on an ideological level. In the apocalypse, good things can be brought out of people, but far too often the worst is brought out of many more. When society is destroyed, it necessarily follows that it must be rebuilt. However, the way in which it's rebuilt doesn't have to be quite the same as before. Both Rick with Alexandria and Negan with the Saviors built societies that were high-functioning and kept its core inhabitants safe. The difference between them was where the power was concentrated. That difference between the two societies can be explained through a distinction made by Karl Marx all the way back in 1848. For many people in the US, the name Marx immediately evokes negative ideas of pseudoscience and communism. While it's true that Marx created the idea of communism, it's never been practiced in the world as he envisioned it. The countries that call themselves communist are a sham of the idea in its purest form. In order to explain what I'm getting at, let me give a very brief breakdown of Marx's theories. Marx thought that the core of everything about human nature could be boiled down to economy, or how people get things they both need or want. As civilizations first arose, the most primitive form of widespread economy was feudalism. In medieval times, a feudal lord would have ownership over a vast amount of land and would allow the lower class, or serfs, to live on his land so long as they worked it for him. Does that sound familiar? Feudalism is, at its core, exactly the system that Negan tried to reintegrate into the post-apocalyptic world. He was the feudal lord, and he allowed communities like Hilltop and Alexandria to live on his land as long as they provided goods for him and his people at sanctuary. Negan may have been a modern-day villain, but he represented a system of oppression that dates back to the medieval era. Still, as we all know, feudalism came to an end eventually. As feudalism faded, another system came into dominance, a system Marx called capitalism. In this system, it was the merchant that had the most power. Trade arose between different communities, even different countries, and as more goods were able to be gotten from faraway places, those that could supply those goods gained in wealth and in turn gained in power. It could be argued that a capitalist system was the ideal that Rick and the other communities strove for. After all, it makes sense to want to try to restore the post-apocalyptic world to order, and the way to restore order is to restore society back into something familiar. Capitalism would be the familiar structure to all those who had lived before the fall. However, I would argue what Rick and the other leaders were truly striving for might actually be closer to something else. Karl Marx thought that there was a next step from capitalism to be made, and the system he thought would replace it was something he called communism. Communism is a divisive concept, and rightly so. The main reason for that is that countries have tried to implement what they call communist systems into their government, and every one of them have invariably failed. However, as Marx thought of it, communism isn't anything close to what those countries actually put into place. Marx thought of communism as a system where everyone was free to enjoy everything, and the work would be done because something called the alienation of labor would be removed. The alienation of labor is something that factors a lot into a capitalist system. It's basically the idea that someone who makes their living working in a setting like a factory, where all they do is one mundane task all day, every day, will naturally resent the work they're doing because they don't take pride in it. They wouldn't do that work if they didn't need the paycheck. Marx thought that the only incentive that someone needed to contribute something productive to society is the ability to take pride in their work. A communist system would be one where someone's basic needs are already guaranteed, so they wouldn't have to work for any external incentive like a salary. They would instead work out of pride for what they're creating and to help out the needs of their community. On the scale of a society as big as the modern world is today, that system would probably never work. It would require a fundamental change in the way we as humans view the world, and if there were an attempt to institute it, the jobs that nobody would want to do would go neglected, and societal infrastructure as we know it would fall apart. However, it's possible that the zombie apocalypse of The Walking Dead may have created the perfect circumstances for a system more like communism than capitalism to arise. People were forced to work together for the greater good, and more important than that, they were forced to work in small, isolated communities. Communist ideas work best on a small scale, where one can see the direct benefit their work is having on other people. A doctor figure like Denise or Sadiq both weren't compensated to a greater extent than the rest of the community, despite putting in work that was arguably both far more taxing and far more crucial than other members of the society. Alexandria wasn't a place where Rick, as the leader, lived in the biggest house or ate the finest food. Scavengers scavenged, fighters fought, doctors healed, and everyone did what was best for the good of the community. The same goes for Oceanside and Hilltop. Earl and Alden learned the trade of blacksmithing because they took pride in how they could help their communities, not for a higher salary or more prestige. Not one of the core societies, outside of Negan's sanctuary to a degree, and in later seasons the Commonwealth, had any monetary system. A society where everyone does everything for the good of their community and because of their own personal pride, where there's no monetary system and no class division, certainly seems like more of a communist system than a capitalist one to me. We've established that the core difference between Negan and Rick's societies are their economic structures. It does seem to follow, then, that the function of Negan as a character is to challenge the ideology of Rick and the others. The oppression of the saviors is not just an assertion of Negan's individual power. It's the most basic and unfair system of feudalism trying to drag down the pure and communistic societies of Alexandria and Hilltop. Much of the criticism of Negan as a character boils down to the idea that his character in the All-Out War arc was much too one-dimensional. I would argue that the narrative actually functions better that way, because the point of Negan isn't that he's an individual villain. He represents an entire philosophy, a harkening back to the medieval days, and to give him more personal nuance than necessary would undermine how effectively he can communicate that idea. After all, it would hardly make sense for Negan to be the face of feudalism and then give him a bunch of sympathetic backstory that makes the audience think he and his system aren't fundamentally flawed. When Rick saves Negan's life after cutting his throat, it's because he is, on a basic level, better morally than Negan is. Feudalism would gladly crush an idealistic society, but that idealistic society can't mercilessly crush feudalism without going against its own moral code, and thus leaving itself in a state of cognitive dissonance. Negan as a character is no doubt much more well-rounded and compelling in later seasons on an individual level. He's given that sympathetic backstory, he tries to atone for his sins, and he ultimately ends up as a member of the core group. However, while this redemption might have served Negan better as a character going forward in the show, it might also, by that same token, retroactively make the All-Out War arc seem worse knowing how his character evolves in the future. The stunting of his individuality during the All-Out War arc made sense, because Negan wasn't supposed to be individuated. Negan was an entire philosophy, an entire system. As Eugene Porter so eloquently put it, the people in that system weren't their own individuals. They were utterly, completely stone-cold Negan. To individuate Negan is to take away how effectively he can be the face of a system of oppression, and as we've already established, the challenge that Rick needed to face was an ideological one. The popular sentiment is that the All-Out War arc was a significant downgrade from earlier seasons. Whether it be the hugely unpopular choice to leave Negan's introduction on a cliffhanger at the end of Season 6, the fake-out of Glenn's death before that, or any number of other factors, audiences were fed up with the changes coming in the show. However, because so many viewers stopped watching after his grisly introduction, they weren't able to see how the All-Out War arc actually unfolded. It was exactly the next challenge that Rick Grimes needed to face, and though I don't agree with many choices, mainly the death of Carl Grimes, I would argue that Negan as a villain in this arc was hugely successful. He's undoubtedly one-dimensional, but it's because of that limited motivation that he can most effectively function as a physical embodiment of feudalism. Because when it comes down to it, The Walking Dead is at its best when contemplating the question of civility over barbarism, virtue over oppression, even when the world the characters live in seems so biased towards the negative. Whether audiences liked it or not, Negan was the best way to allow the story to operate in that space. For The Walking Dead, Negan was the perfect villain.